Rolling.
All right, we are getting started. Welcome to the BEMA Lubbock discussion group. If you're online, we're discussing his bow in the clouds, Genesis 6 through 9. What did you guys think about the flood myths?
Wow. You know, it's interesting. There's so many parallel stories about, Earth being devastated by either flood, ice age, what I liked, he mentioned the Gilgamesh.
The Epic of Gilgamesh?
Yeah. And that...
Upnavashtim?
Yeah, you pronounce that very well, by the way.
I've listened to it enough.
And, how in that account, those were what we refer to as false gods. And these gods were out to destroy the world. And it took the main character, he had to outsmart the gods in order to save the world. Whereas the account of Noah, I like the way he set that up, in that God had a plan to save mankind. But, before he did that, God was grieved that he made man because of all the corruption and evil and wickedness, that man's inclination was, seemed
Evil all the time.
Evil all the time, and that evil was spreading. And then he equated that, like cancer.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't know when to stop creating.
Yeah. And anything that doesn't know when to stop, it will wind up destroying.
I just remember my grandmother teaching me the story of Noah. Gosh, probably from birth. I mean, you did it in Sunday school class. Probably seemed like once a month, to teach the kids. And the story was
kids
always...
like animals.
Because kids like animals. And the story was always kind of sugar-coated for the kids, and you kind of grew up believing that. And you, like I said, you never look for the problems. You just say, this is how it is. This is how it happened. And God was just mad at the earth and mad at people, so he's going to kill them all. Well, that's basically the same story that all these other stories, because from all around the Middle East, they all have that same story, and like I said, there probably is some truth to that, because if there's that many different stories from different cultures in their history, something most likely happened. From a scientific standpoint.
Yeah.
But then on the other part is that...
Where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yeah. But the other part was, I never really looked at it as, it's not that God destroyed the earth, just like all these other stories. It was how God was different in the story than all the other gods.
Yeah.
And I think that's what really stood out to me for the first time, really, like... I was sitting there kind of arrogantly thinking, well, I know this story, but this really stood out, that, God was different. And to start looking for that, how God was different in the stories, not how he was the same.
Yeah. Growing up, I think the story, it was highlighted like God's wrath. And we don't necessarily look at how, like what you were saying, how he's different. And so it makes me kind of think, like, how did we just swallow the fact that God is, like, that narrative of, like, God being wrathful and God, like, wanting to wipe out everything, like, that he saw that needed to just go. Like, it made me think about that. And then think about, like, how he was comparing, like, the different mythologies and everything. I went through a really big Greek nerd phase where I got into a lot of these different stories from Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Norse. It was a lot, but I would pick out a lot of these like different stories that had a heavy emphasis with the flood. Like the first one I saw was Pandora's Box, and how it ended pretty much very similarly to like Noah's story, where it was just a little different, but basically like, they're surviving people. And then so him calling back to these stories, it's like, okay, like it's not just about God's wrath, it is about what he wanted to do with humanity, like his intention to make everything new again.
So how did you feel knowing there was more than one flood myth?
All right. So at first I was like, "Oh, okay, like that's cool to remember." But then I was like, "Wait, the way that so many of these different cultures had that as like their origin story, I was like, who? First of all, who messed it up? Like, how did they be like very similar but then completely different and veer off in all these different directions? I was like, what happened?
Playing telephone.
Yeah.
I mean, it made sense to me that it would be more different stories, because when the story is passed down, it changes. Then if the first part of chapter 6, it talks about the sons of God coming down and then marrying the daughters of man. So you have the DNAs mixing in with the human DNA, and so that always made me think that maybe this is where our Greek and mythologies come from. That maybe that's where, a lot of the things we hear about are growing up. So it makes sense that there'd be multiple stories, but then again, stories passed down have a tendency to change. I know there's stories in my family that have changed from one person telling it to another person telling it. But it seems like the one that hasn't had much change was the story of Noah.
When your uncle goes hunting and the bear gets bigger every day.
The fish.
The fish turns into a bear.
Or a multitude of fish.
I thought it was really cool that he said, this story of Gilgamesh is from Mesopotamia. And they point out, well, where is Mesopotamia?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That was interesting.
Chaldea. And who was from Chaldea?
Abraham.
So this story was something like it had been told to him his whole life. And
Thank you.
so, but also the fact that if you look at it and you break it down, it's a retelling of the whole Genesis story again, too. The whole story of Noah. And you just kind of go step by step, oh, yeah, it is. And it's creating a new, but similar in the same story.
I was reading Genesis chapter 6, verse 1 through 3, and I found it interesting because there's a footnote. Well, it's not a footnote, but there's like a little note in parentheses in verse 3. It says, "Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with humans forever." And the "with" says, my spirit will not remain in humans forever, for they are mortal, parentheses, corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. So I thought, my spirit will not remain in humans forever. So at some point in time, that's got to be how they were living so long, I assume, is that his spirit was remaining in them. And then he said we're limited to 120 years because we're corrupt. And I'm like, yeah, pretty much. I can't disagree with you there. I did find an article on PBS for the flood myths, and then another article for the Midrash that I can share with you guys in the discussion or on Facebook. But I went through the other flood myths, and you already mentioned Mesopotamia. There's Aztec, Greek, Hindu, Buddhist, China, Norse, and even the Aborigines had one. The Norse one was a bloodbath. So I was like, go figure. The Norse one would be a bloodbath.
Yes.
So the question was, why would he destroy the world right off the bat? I think their guest was asking that. Why would God destroy the world? And Stephen was kind of touching on, the angels came down and took wives and then had children. But is that the only reason, or is there no reason because this is just a retelling? You know what I mean? Is it just... Is God just taking this story that already exists and saying, look at how crappy these gods are, this is how good I am,
Right. Or is it the way that parents were passing down the stories to the kid of, this is the God we serve, is the good God? Maybe.
But I always think back to who's telling this.
Yeah.
So it's Moses to the Israelites. So God is giving this story to Moses at Mount Sinai. So Is he telling Moses about Abraham? Do they already know about Abraham? You know what I mean? I assume they already know about Abraham as a patriarch.
Yeah, I'm thinking that they probably, one, had a genealogy that was handed down.
When this was written, yes. They would have known
and what
about
they
it.
would,
Yeah.
at that time, be sort of like a synagogue where they would meet.
It's just 480 years in Egypt.
Yeah.
You know,
And
that
a lot of them were
rinses
worshiping
things
Egyptian
away.
gods,
Yeah.
they Egyptian culture. But I would think that they would have, held on to those stories, and that's where Moses would learn it, because you got to think Moses wasn't raised Hebrew. He was raised Egyptian. So it's not like he was told these stories, growing up, because he didn't live in their households.
Yeah.
He knew he was Jewish, but where did he pick those up later besides, Mount Sinai, or all the people that he brought out and compiled all the stories that they had known about Abraham. And and I'm thinking, if anybody was ever going to write a story about their family history, there's a lot of history that most people would want to have left out.
Yeah.
Or
Like
telling
your
them a way to make sure-
grandfather slept with the prostitute, and thinking that come to find out, no, it's your daughter-in-law.
Yeah.
Why in the world would they have left that stuff in there but to prove truth more than anything else? But I look at it as, that somewhere along the line, those were handed down to Moses from all the people that they took out of Egypt. Someone had to have those stories written down, besides what God then told him when he was up there too.
Yeah, I just wonder if that's where Paul gets his skill set at the temple of the unknown God. You know what I mean? Like Paul's like, oh, see this statue.
Let me
You
tell
see
you.
this flood myth. It's like,
Let me tell you what we know.
yeah.
But that's interesting, Ray. But also too, Moses did leave Egypt. After he killed the Egyptian, and he wandered in the desert until he met his wife, and there he was a shepherd with his father-in-law. And so I imagine they probably sat around the campfire and probably swapped some stories, about history and things like that. So he probably had some exposure, but I think mostly everything was revealed to him, by God as he's writing down, these 7 books.
Especially if they have the chiasm the way they do with the numbers.
Isn't that interesting?
It's like, there's no way. Well, I mean, there is a way humans would do it, but
Yeah.
I just feel like God knows what he's doing.
And I never looked at Genesis and these chapters. And first of all, until we started looking at these podcasts, I couldn't tell you what a chiasm is.
Me
If you
neither.
said it, I would have said Gesundheit. Or point you to a doctor so you can get that taken care of.
Yeah. Let's get that chiasm removed.
But it's amazing the numbers and the story within the story. And there's a middle story. Wow.
This is how I imagine why rabbis do what they do.
Yeah.
Is because of this kind
Yes.
of thing. It's like, let me see how much I can jam pack into this, and then you unfold it
Do you wanna-
on your own.
Do you
gotta
want to talk
figure it out.
about the chiasm in case there's some folks who may be just joining us?
Like, just say what a chiasm is.
Yeah.
Well, I couldn't tell you what a chiasm is.
I was hoping you could, because I don't think I can, not very well.
I have the definition of a chiasm.
I'm sorry, and I
It's
didn't
like
mean
a
to put
number
you on the
pattern,
spot.
isn't it?
But I imagine there are some folks online that maybe are, kind of wondering, what is that? What are they talking about? And I sort of remember basically what it is. It's basically.
I got the definition.
You have the.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it's a poetic rhetorical device in many languages. Originates in Greek for X-shaped and looks like a cross. The structure of 2 phrases or sentences using a distinctive structure in the first, then reversing it in the second.
So
I
it
don't
kind
know
of-
if that tells you what
So
it
it kind of
means.
starts out with a subject, and then at the end of the story, it takes the same subject and points back to the beginning of it. So it starts out going one way, and then it ends going back to the beginning.
I think a classic one that I didn't write down in my notes, but I saw on the list of examples was the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
That's a good example.
Or no, that wasn't it. It was don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So that was a chiasm. So that was a pretty famous one.
Yeah, it is. And it's a very good example. So that kind of gets us thinking now, as we read through this, and we can look for these patterns because they're all over the place and they're so repetitive. Like God is, I love it in the podcast, he's saying, over and over, it talks about a covenant. Mm-hmm. I'm going to make a covenant. I'm going to remind you. Now, so does God, and it also says he remembered Noah. Mm-hmm. It's kind of odd because we don't really think of God having a memory problem. And he doesn't. That's for us because we're the ones that have a memory problem. And he's reminding us of, that he hasn't forgotten about Noah. Because I know for me sometimes when I expect things to go well. I want things to go well. I'm happy when things are going well. When things aren't going well, I begin to wonder, okay, where's God in this? Mm-hmm. Things are supposed to be going good. He's a good father. A good father is supposed to protect his children and to give them all the good things that they want. I have wants and I have needs. And sometimes God's ways aren't my ways. And I want to think that my ways are better. And I know Mark was here talking about this before, Mark and Cindy, that God's ways are higher than our ways. And he is a good God, and we just have to trust in him. But sometimes, I think like a child. And when things don't go my way, what do? I get angry.
Fall on the floor, throw a fit.
That's right. That's right. Now, I may do it in various ways.
Yeah.
More passive, aggressive ways. I might withdraw, but because a lot of times especially now when I see what's going on in the world right now, I don't like it. I see division, hatred, and very seldom do we ever hear good news. It's there, it's happening, but we just don't hear about it nearly often enough. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking, this is not the way it's supposed to be. Okay, God, when are you going to fix it? Now would be a good time. But he's saying, no, now is not the time. I don't know. He's got a plan. And we just have to trust in his plan. But he's constantly reminding us about this covenant relationship. And he's saying it over and over. In fact, the rabbi in this podcast, he's almost being sarcastic, and he says, after all that, if you're Noah, you're tempted to, okay, God, are we going to talk about covenant? Because he mentioned it so many times.
So can we make a covenant now?
So can we make a covenant now?
So I went through Genesis chapter 6 and 7, 8. I have 6 and 8 written down here, but it could be wrong. But I went through and looked at the numbers that he was talking about because I wanted to see, for myself, where all that was written down.
Right, because those were pretty overwhelming. And when I started hearing that, my mind is starting to explode.
Yeah.
I do wonder if some of that, like even what Ray was saying, if some of the struggles that we have is because we think from a Western mindset. We don't think.
Yes.
Even knowing what a chiasm is, I wonder even when it's written in English, is it noticeable? Mm. Because in other language it might be noticeable because some of the words are similar, but ours would be different words, trying to make it sound
similar,
more clear, or whatever. But maybe we missed that stuff. But I think made me think about Moses having been raised as an Egyptian, but he was there because of Joseph. Right. And he would have probably known that because Egyptians, from at least what I understand, is they especially the higher ranks tend to be very intellectual, and they have a lot of they probably kept a lot of those things, and so maybe he knew it from a historical perspective. This is where people came from. This was Abraham. Maybe he had learned it, Egyptian school. But I think sometimes for us, we try to look at it, and even with this, I just wonder, we're trying to figure out, how did it work? And is that the point? It's not the point. How did he do it? But we like to know that.
Exactly.
I do. I like to know that. I want to know, how did it go? How did he know? And I think in all of it, did God give it to him? Did God give him those things, or did he know it or was it a mix of things? But I just think because of our Western mindset, we want to know all that stuff, and I think God is like, do you trust?
Well, I mean, I think that's why
You
the
just trust
Midrash.
me that it happened.
I think that's why the Midrash exists, is because they want to know how.
Yeah.
Like, they have opinions about it. Like,
Right.
the Midrash about chapter 6 has like 3 different ideas about why the angels came down and decided to have children with women. Like, it's just we have to make stuff up. We have to try to figure things out.
And it's cool to think
That's the
about.
way we are,
It's fun to think about,
Yeah, our mind has to fill in the blank somehow.
Yeah, yeah.
But you think about, with Moses, the Hebrews, they were in Egypt for 400 years. It didn't say they were slaves for all the 400 years. It says a king came along that did not know about Joseph and what he had did for their country. So it could have been 100 years. It could have been 200
Right.
years.
Yeah, we don't know.
But up until that point, they were living as Hebrews in this other country, and they were just assimilating into that country and their ideas and their theology and their culture. But I'm pretty sure that because they had that part or section of that were just the Hebrews, they probably did have those stories. They did have them probably written down. You probably had educated individuals. You look at Joseph, being how educated he was. And then, somewhere along the way, they had some of those stories available that Moses was able to get his hands on. And then God probably taught him everything else he needed to know on top of it. But one of the things about the chiasm we were talking about too is it's not just that the story goes in a V pattern, but it's where the V is pointing, towards the center. In a chiasm, it's kind of the treasure within the story. What is this story pointing to?
Right.
To find the treasure in it. What is God really trying to say here? And I think in all those chiasms, that's one of the things it points to is looking at the treasure.
You're right, Ray.
Within it. So,
I think so.
And the whole point, the reason why they use that tool was to get you to think, meditate on it, think about it, and really think about, well, how is God working all through this, and what is he trying to tell me? What is his story?
I agree with that. And also, Roddy, you brought up a point, the difference in our Western way of thinking about things. In the way we write things, like I was trained when I write a letter, we avoid repetition. It's kind of considered a sin almost. And so we prevent chiasms from forming in our language.
Sure.
And so it's not so that concept can be kind of foreign to us, and if we're not around that, we're not really going to pick up on that.
Yeah.
I know my hand's up because
Yeah.
it was a totally different concept.
I think, though, when I think about it, we do write them in our papers. Because if you think about it, we have our opening statement
Right.
and our conclusion. And what does the conclusion do?
It takes back
Repeats the opening statement, and you're building into the treasure in the center of the body.
You tell them what you told them, and you told them what you told them.
Yeah, it's always supposed to be 3 paragraphs, 5 paragraphs, 3 paragraphs, 1 in the middle. You know what I mean? So I think we kind of do it, but we don't. We haven't perfected it to this degree.
The other hard part
in
is
our writing.
in Hebrew, a lot of this stuff makes sense if you read Hebrew. And you would see the chiasms. But like I said, when it's translated to English, sometimes they would switch out words, not really knowing how to translate it.
Yeah.
And so even in our NIV, even the most updated NIVs, they're still trying to figure that out. And and that's this has been an incredible tool to really learn that and understand that there was hidden treasures in it. There is chiasms. There is this literary tool that they use as it translate to English and make it easiest for us to understand. Not necessarily. This is what's great about him teaching, helping us to see that.
Well, I think another example would be like Asian written language, because a lot of Asian written language, like Japanese, I think, has pictures in their words, and so does Hebrew.
Yep.
So it's like there's no way to
This word
translate
means
all
this
that
picture in
into
my mind.
English for like one or two words to say,
Yeah.
this is what this picture means. When you put it with this picture, this is what it means. When you put this word together, this is what it means. But think about the pictures too. You know, there's no way for us to know that.
That's right. One whole paragraph just for one word.
Yeah.
And it's all consonants with no vowels.
So I went through and looked at the numbers, and Genesis 7:4 is the first 7. Genesis 7:10 is the next 7. Genesis 7:17 is the 40. Genesis 7:24 is the 150. And then it goes to Genesis 8:150, 8 verse 3, Genesis 8:6, 40, Genesis 8:10, 7, Genesis 8:12, 7. He was talking about the numbers form the chiasm in this case. And it makes me laugh when I hear him talk about, do you have the audacious audacity? I like, just say audacity.
Yes.
Or do you have the audaciousness? I don't know. But the center of the chiasm, like you said, he remembers Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. So that's kind of where, like you mentioned, it's going back through Genesis 1 again. So what happens in Genesis 1, there's water, he parts it. That's the first thing he does. He doesn't create water. It's already there. He just says he parts the water.
But what was above the water?
His spirit, yeah.
The
His
wind.
spirit is
It talks about
It's the same word.
ruach.
Yes.
that hovered.
Ruach and Merehefet over the waters. So God separates the water with his spirit, and then he, like you said, what happens when you open a window? Light comes in. So let there be light. And then he goes on to say, sends the birds out. That's day 5. And then at the end, when Noah and the animals come out, that's pretty much the rest of creation. So like he said, what's the one thing you're looking for that you are trying to find if you see all of creation play out that way?
So you're looking for the Sabbath.
Yeah, looking for the Sabbath. And I was thinking, because the center of the chiasm was God remembered Noah, I kept thinking about when it says remember the Sabbath. And I don't know why I keep thinking that, but that word remembered sticks out because, like you said, God isn't forgetful.
Right.
So it's like that thing you trip over while you're reading it. You're like, why? But what do you mean he remembers God? It's like him saying, where are you in the Garden of Eden? You know, it stands out because now it's time to start paying attention to something. And he goes on to say, you know, this is the covenant that I'm going to remember. And he was asking Brent in the podcast, you know, he has an affinity for numbers, and we have an affinity for odd numbers because they point towards a center. And he was talking about how covenant was 7 times, earth was 7 times, clouds was 5 times, and bow was 3 times.
Wow.
And it points all to that center verse in chapter 9, verses 14 through 15, when it says, whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. And I like biblical numerology or numerics and the meaning of numbers. So I found a website that I have been using, you know, for a couple of weeks. But 7, the number 7 is for completeness and perfection. Number 5 is God's grace. Number 3 is completeness. 10 is testimony, law, responsibility, and the completeness of order. And 40 is a period of testing, trial, or probation. It seems kind of obvious. You know, everybody is doing something for 40 days. So does any of that stand out to you guys as I read through Genesis 9, chapter 9, verse 14 through 15, the meaning of numbers in the Bible, the number of times these things show up? Anything interesting?
I guess the fact that those numbers and what they mean, the perfection, like the completeness and God's grace, and the fact that God put that there as a reminder, like, I won't do this again. It's like, it's our protection, pretty much. Because we really haven't changed that much, like at all, from the people that were just wiped out. Like we're the same,
God hasn't changed either.
and He hasn't changed either.
So
and
neither one of us have changed.
no one's changed here,
Our
but
technology is God.
yeah, that's
the only
pretty
thing.
much it. But God's promises remain the same because His nature has remained the same, and He put that there as our protection because He knows that we weren't going to change either.
Yeah, pretty much.
I think one thing that stood out to me when he was talking about the bow, that he put it so that he would be reminded. Did God forget? God needs reminding. I always thought that was interesting, but I think what
is.
it was that he talked about, it was not so much that God would forget, but God was taking the responsibility for us to remember on Himself. God took on the responsibility of remembering for Himself, and that kind of reminded me of when Abraham's was making the sacrifice in the covenant, where he split the
Yeah,
offerings
yeah.
and the fire by night.
And walk through.
Walked through them. It's because He knew humans were flawed. We can't keep our promises. So God took responsibility of that promise. He took our side of the deal on Himself to be responsible for that.
Yes.
There
So
seems
that
to be a
was-
pattern.
Yeah.
And I forgot the word that he used.
The Suzerain vessel?
The
Caesar
Caesar
vessel.
vessel.
Yeah.
That's it. That the purpose of the Caesar vessel was to basically, okay, there is a covenant, and the Caesar vessel had to proclaim it. In other words, you had to come up with it. You had to prove it, that it was there.
Or else they could do whatever they wanted to you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And whereas God now took on the role as the Caesar vessel, and He's reminding us over and over again about the covenant. He's proclaiming the covenant, so we don't have to.
So the suzerain is the powerful party, which is God, and the vassal is the less powerful party that needs help of some kind. So when you put them together, then he's the suzerain, we're the vassal.
We're the vassal, right.
One thing I was telling Jessica before I came up here during dinner, I was asking her about a rainbow. Like, what does she think when she thinks about a rainbow? Of course, she was like, colors, God's promise
Right.
to never destroy the earth again. But I was telling her, so what is a bow? And she was like a hair bow? I was like, no, like a bow and arrow.
Yeah.
And I was telling her, I was like, so a bow and arrow is like this, and the rainbow points up like this. So the next time destruction comes, who is it pointing to?
Pointing toward God.
So He's the one that's going to take the destruction, not us. And that's what He did.
Yeah.
He did it with Jesus.
Yeah.
He said he'd get to it later.
Yeah.
And I don't remember
I don't think he did.
what he says, but
But
I know I've already gone through it. But I mean, that blew me away when just thinking about the symbolism of a bow in the sky pointed toward God, saying, I'm not going to destroy you guys. I'm going to do it to myself. It's like telling your kid, like, I'm not going to spank you again. I'm going to spank myself.
Well, that's what I always wondered.
Said it's much worse.
God was angry at the earth and everybody in it. Did Jesus go, Dad, plan B. Let's save it.
That was always the plan. There was no plan B. That was plan A.
I just wonder though if the people and even us, do we look at that thing and go, "What? That God was willing to do that?" Like God, and my humanistic side goes, well, we understand that the rainbow has to do with the curvature of the earth and yada yada yada, scientific, stuff.
Prism.
But to think that God did that, and He says it, so it's not just a physical happening. That He did it, and just the idea, because even with Abraham, which I know we're not. It's funny because I feel like we're already past Abraham, but we're not to Abraham yet.
Yeah, we haven't gotten there yet.
But because we've done This Is Us, it feels like we're past. Anyway, but with Abraham, it's the same thing as Suzerain Vassal Treaty. Whenever God splits the animal, right, and the idea being, if I don't hold up my end of the covenant, maybe what happened to this animal will happen to me. That's the idea of that whole treaty. But the same thing, God is the one who took that, meaning if we didn't hold it up, He was going to take the punishment.
Yeah.
But what I wonder is, did they look at that and I mean, I'm sure they it's hard because we look at it all from knowing the end of the story already. So we can look at it and go, oh, God was doing this. And they might not have known that. But to me, it just makes me think, man, I need to take this serious. If God from that long ago was planning to take the punishment that would keep Him from destroying us, do I just go, well, it's just how we are, and it's how it is? No. I think I should go, whoa, that's crazy. I need to do great for God, because look what He did. And that challenges me. And just when you're talking about it, and you said something about the next destruction that would come, and he talked about that too. But it just makes me think, wow, I need to be a lot more grateful that, because I mean, I know he's not going to flood the earth, but it's so much deeper than that.
Yeah.
And this thing, I got to be really grateful and work hard to honor God. It's not a matter of, and it's funny because then it makes me think, why do I worry about punishment so much? If that's God's plan all the time, is not to punish me, but to let Jesus take the punishment. But I worry about punishment.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny. It's almost like, I don't believe you. It's exactly what it is. I don't believe you. And I think, man, I've got to get back to really believing there's not going to be a punishment for me. You know? Now, I mean, there could be if I decide to walk away and forget believing I don't believe anymore. But that's crazy that there's not a punishment for me. And it makes me sad that I sometimes doubt it. You know? And I wonder if it makes God sad. He's like, why? I told you. And he keeps doing it. You know?
Yeah.
This one, the
Time
next
and time
one, the
again.
next one. Yeah.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine earlier, and they were worried about, you know, salvation and stuff like that, and they're just always thinking about how they don't feel like they're saved because they don't deserve to be or whatever. And I was telling them, I was like, you know, when Adam and Eve were naked in the garden, and they realized they were naked, God didn't say, He didn't punish them. He said, why are you naked? Or who told you were naked? You know, what voice are you listening to? And I was telling him, I was like, you're listening to these voices telling you you're not enough. You were created in God's image. For you to say that His salvation is not going to save you, you're saying Jesus' sacrifice was not enough to save you. And you know it was enough.
Right.
So I'm like, trust that you are made in His image.
Yeah.
And you're not what these other voices are telling you. I was like, whenever you hear these things in your head or people tell you things, like, submit that to God.
Yeah.
See what He says about it. Does He say that you're a worthless piece of trash? No, He says you're created in my image. I sent my Son to die for your sins to save your life. You know,
Yeah.
so it's like, I know it's hard. I guess I've at some point in time moved past all that, and I just now I'm to the point where I think about how I'm going to respond to God when I see Him. Am I going to cower in fear or jump for joy?
Right.
You know, is it like, am I going to be afraid that you're going to punish me, or I'm going to say, you know, yes, finally you're here, you know?
Yeah.
The latter is what I'm constantly thinking about. But at some point in time, before, I thought, I'm going to cower in fear. Every knee will, you know, bend. Every person will bow because they're afraid.
Yeah.
But am I going to bow because I'm afraid, or am I going to bow because I'm in awe?
Yeah.
Because you're finally here. Like, this is
Right.
all I've wanted, is to see you, and now you're finally there. You
Right.
know?
Right.
That's what I think about.
And I think there is a challenge because people say, I don't think I'm enough. We're not enough.
Yeah.
And that's the point. That's the point, exactly. We're not enough, but he paid it, so there is enough. We're not enough.
But are we, though?
What do you mean?
Because He said, you're enough. Our shame caused Him to cover us. You know what I mean? Like that was the
I see
whole
what you mean.
cycle.
He put a very high
shame.
value on us.
Yeah.
But we think enough meaning I got to do
Yeah.
enough
Yeah.
to good versus bad. But I think the challenge with that, though, and this is something I still wrestle with, is there are commands we have to follow.
Yeah.
I can't just go, well, God, I forgive me. I don't have to do anything. That's not true.
No.
Jesus said, you can't be my disciple. You know, and so I think that's the how do we find the balance of that? And I think the balance just comes from motivation. If I'm doing it because I'm afraid of hell, or I'm doing it because I don't have to go to hell. And He told me, you are worth Jesus. That's what you're worth.
Wow.
And because of that, it makes me go, man, you know what? I got you, God. I'm gonna do everything you said because look, you know. And so I think that's the challenge is getting our head in the right place, you know, where we're understanding,
Yeah.
but letting that motivation move us to obey. And please God, because we're grateful.
Yeah.
You know, it's feels like a circle.
Yeah. That's why I like the parable of the treasure in the field. I think I
Yes.
told you before.
Yes, yeah,
And how
yeah.
we always think that we're the man walking by, finding the treasure in the field and buying it, giving up everything and buying it to have the treasure. But you can also think about it as God is the one walking by,
And we have the treasure.
buying the field to get us,
Right.
to get the treasure.
Wow.
And he did. He left heaven.
He did.
Like, he left everything to come to this field to
Yeah.
get us.
And he paid everything he had.
Wow.
And what did he get? He got us.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like Zacchaeus. You know, when of all the people for Jesus to stay with, you know, he said, "Come down. I'm going to stay at your house."
Yeah.
And everybody's looking, going, "What? That guy?" And during that meal, you know, Zacchaeus, I guess listening to Jesus, got it, and he says, "You know, look now. I'm going to give whatever I've stolen from somebody. I'm going to give back, you know,
Double, right?
double
Something
or
like
three
that.
times more," which was basically in accordance with the law. And you know, and Jesus said, "Today salvation has come to this household." You know, and my envision when he's saying that, you know, he's saying this with great joy. And he says, "Look now, look, you know, what I'm going to do." And I don't think he was sad at all when he did it. I think he was very pleased.
Yeah.
You know.
That's very interesting because he says salvation came, but salvation came in response to Zacchaeus' response. Salvation comes because as Zacchaeus responded properly.
He had repented.
Yes.
Like he,
Yeah.
like I think at some point in time they talk about repentance, not being like turning around.
Right.
Just, it's not just going in a different direction. It's turning around and coming back to God.
It's not proving. It's just I'm not doing that anymore.
Yeah, but it's coming back to God.
It
Like
is
you
coming
started
back to God,
here,
right.
you wandered off. Repentance is coming back.
Right.
It's like we always
the
say the
prodigal son.
prodigal son.
Yeah.
You know, he left and came back.
Yeah.
Like that's repentance, is coming back to God, coming back to the original state He created you in. And so when Zacchaeus was like, "I repent, I'm going to do all these things in accordance with the law,"
Yeah.
and he was joyful about it because the Jews looked at the law as a gift from God. It's not like these things
Yes.
we have to do, they're commands. Like, it's a gift in the desert for our
Yeah.
wedding day. Like,
Right.
that's how they look at it. But we just look, it's a bunch of rules.
Yeah.
You know, I can't kill people. I can't commit adultery. I can't, you know, something like that. When it's so prevalent everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, people are committing adultery left and right. And now people are killing people in the streets left and right. You know, the murder right down here on 50th and Q the other night, 2 brothers, one killing the other one. It's just like,
Wow. Yeah. What's going on?
and that's like something that to just regular people is just like, why? It's your brother. Why would you kill him?
Right.
There's enough death going on. Whatever you're fighting over, just
Yeah.
it's not worth it.
Just stop it.
What was that, Abel?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, I think for me, a lot of times when we blow it, we mess up. You know, we take it as our identity. This is who I am. You know, I'm a sinner. I'm a drunkard. I'm a thief or a murderer. You know, and we say that's who I am. But in the Hebrew culture in the East, it's like it's not an identity. It's a thing.
It's just what you did.
It's what you did, and you stop. You know, you just stop.
Yeah. We're going to talk about Zacchaeus when? 2023?
At the weekly rate we're going. Yes.
Yes.
So one thing he was talking about, the sign of the vassal, he said like a wedding ring. It's a reminder of a covenant. And I was thinking how a wedding ring is a reminder of a covenant between a husband and wife. So could you imagine if every time you got divorced you had to cut your finger off where your wedding ring is? There'd be a bunch of people with like no fingers on one
Oh,
hand.
maybe we can work things out.
Yeah.
Be like I'm a shop teacher.
Yeah.
2 fingers left.
And I love how it ends with
Careful, son.
how he's going back to he's bringing the chiasm back around and saying, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil, I will not destroy the earth, because God knows when to say enough.
Yes.
And there's a theme that comes up later, but he wants to restore things.
Yeah.
Like Ray's gotten that far, I think, but it's just like he's not a God of punishment; he's a God of restoration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And me and Mark and I were talking about it the other night. We're talking about the justice system and how the justice system is built around punishment. It's not built
Sure.
around restoration.
Sure.
Like if we were going to restore people, we would do things like God does with Cain. Like he didn't kill Cain. He didn't put him in jail. He just sent him away. And he was like, "Oh, this is too much for me to bear." And even when he sent him away, he gave him something so that he was protected. It's like we're not trying to restore anything with our justice system. And they say in the East they worked on it a lot more than we do, but we come from more Roman side of punishment.
Very much.
I look at all of what we've read so far is story, 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 story. But then God says there's an underlining story that runs all through them, and that's what I want you to hear.
Yeah.
Is that I'm here for you. I want you. You're important to me, and I care about you, and I'm here. And I want to make it. I want you to make it available to everyone.
Yeah.
I want you to open the doors. It's not I'm going to open the doors. I want you to open the doors to my kingdom. And that same story goes from beginning all the way to the end of this entire book. And then that story carries over still to us to this very day, and will carry over to our children and our children's children. But we have to make sure that door continues to stay open. Because if you look at our country, that door is shutting. I started thinking about this a few weeks ago. It's like, what's scary, in the next 2 to 3 generations, Jesus may not even exist in this country anymore.
Well, what's the quote? We're only
word.
one generation away from...
Yeah,
Right.
And that's a really
Not
scary
having
thought to think about it. If we're not teaching our kids, then who's going to teach them?
That's so true.
Because right now, majority of our country, they know the name of Jesus. They could care less. There's no heart to it. There's no teaching to it.
What is it, having the form but denying its power?
Yeah, and so it's just, and as I've gotten further even in these lessons, about learning about God's kingdom, what his dream is. This has been his dream all along. And it came to fulfillment with Christ. But he still expects that same thing with us is, hey, here's my dream. I want you to carry it out. And but it's up to us.
Yeah, and
to
that
make
stuff
that
challenges me because I don't want to be afraid of that. Let's go do it. We'll have to wait for the government to say Jesus is Lord? No, that's our job, right? And that kind of gets me going like, no. We need to go, right? It's not outside of our hands. It's not. It's in God's hands. But man, that fires me up. It's funny you just said about would Jesus be here? I'm like, if I have something to do with it, it will. Now that doesn't mean maybe everybody. But I just think, that gets me going. I'm like, we got to go, brothers, sisters.
We do.
Yeah.
So one of those underlying themes
Everybody.
as we go on too is talking
Most of
about
you.
God's kingdom versus the version of
Empire versus
empire.
Shalom. Yeah.
In empire, if you look at and one of the things I was studying too was testing the spirit to see, testing your own spirit to know what is right. Is how I feel or what I think according to the spirit, or is it according to the sinful nature, the beast? Same thing that goes on in our government. So if our government is only self-focused and only thinking of itself and building its own power and its own idea, doesn't matter which party it is, they're all thinking the same thing. It's the beast.
Yep.
Okay? They're only concerned about themselves. But am I going to be focused on the Spirit producing fruit? And that's what Jesus was even constantly telling the Jews, or even John, repent in keeping with producing fruit. So which of the two? So when I'm having an attitude or when I'm thinking about myself or whatever, I stop now and kind of think, I need to test this. Is this from the Spirit, or is this of the beast? Is this the beast part of me? Which am I going to choose? How am I going to carry that out? Because I get to choose. And so I really started thinking about, testing the Spirit, and that it really kind of opened my eyes to how governments really look at things. And now I'm like, you guys just go do your own thing. You'll figure it out. But this is what God wants me to do.
Yep.
Just trust the story.
So who cares who's president? I know we have the right to vote and everything else. But really, it's really not that important as what's I need to choose.
Right.
As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.
Yeah.
It did convict me the other day.
Let Caesar
yesterday,
go be Caesar. And
with all the people that went and drove around the loop.
yeah, that's all the
Thousands.
trucks.
And I'm like,
They were
if we could
all
be that
over.
fired up for God,
Wow.
it will change a world.
I texted my dad the same thing. I was like, we had the people driving around the loop, and I'm like, if we just drove around the loop for Jesus,
I know.
like thousands of people
Yeah.
flying Jesus
With
flags.
screaming and yelling and with the flag.
Yeah.
We're so messed up.
Mhm.
You ever have another event? You used to have the March for Jesus events when I was younger.
Yeah.
I have no idea what that is. What?
Well, that's probably before your time.
It has to be. Yeah.
Probably
was
before
when I
my
was a
time,
teen.
too. So
That was back in the 40s.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm saying
the
since-
40s.